The Duke of Kestrel Chase did not raise his voice. He never did. His power was in the chilling quiet that followed his words, in the weight they carried in the still air of the grand, neglected library. "Miss Penrose," he said, his voice a low timbre of ice and iron. "Remember who you are speaking to." Louisa Penrose did not flinch. She met his gaze across the vast, scarred expanse of the mahogany desk. His eyes, the colour of a winter sky, held no warmth, only a rigid, weary pride. She knew precisely who she was speaking to. Gideon Devereux, 9th Duke of Kestrel Chase, a man whose title was as ancient as the skeletal oaks gripping the hills outside, and whose fortune was as hollow as a fallen log. She, on the other hand, was a ghost, a name on a legal document held by her solicitor, the anonymous entity who had, 3 weeks prior, purchased the entirety of the crushing debt attached to his title. She inclined her head, a gesture of deference that cost her nothing, and yet was not an apology. "I am aware, Your Grace. I am speaking to the man who requires a 5-year stay on the principal of his loans. My employer is willing to grant that. The terms, however, are not negotiable." His jaw tightened, a subtle shift of muscle that was the only sign of the fury he held in check. She waited. Waiting was a skill she had perfected over 10 years in her aunt's house, a silent, watchful endurance that had become her only armour. Her life before Kestrel Chase had been measured in the rustle of paper and the scratch of a nib against a ledger. After her parents' death, she had been taken in by her mother's sister, Lady Honora Farrow, a woman who saw charity as an investment and expected a return. Louisa, with her plain face and her father's merchant-class mind for figures, was not a marital asset like her pretty, placid cousin Millicent. She was, instead, an unpaid clerk. From the age of 15, she had managed the Farrow household accounts, stretching shillings into pounds, discreetly selling off minor assets to cover gambling debts, and fielding creditors with a calm politeness that infuriated them more than any protestation. Her world was the small, chilly morning room where she worked. It smelled of beeswax and fading ink. Her view was a patch of manicured lawn her aunt insisted upon, even when the gardener's wages were 2 months in arrears. She would sit for hours, her spine straight, her fingers smudged with ink, tracing the slow, certain decline of her own family's fortune. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency of emotion she could not afford to spend. Her only secret, her only power, was the inheritance her father had left her. It was not a vast sum, but he had invested it shrewdly with a man of business in the city, instructing that it not be touched by her guardians. Lady Farrow knew of its existence, but believed it to be a pittance, a few £100 at most. She was wrong. Through careful stewardship and the passage of years, it had grown into a small, potent fortune. It was Louisa's silence, her patience, her escape. The name Kestrel Chase had first entered the Farrow household as a target. The new Duke, recently returned from the wars on the continent, was unmarried, and, it was assumed, enormously wealthy. Lady Farrow had seen him as the perfect, if somewhat grim, solution to Millicent's future and the family's precarious position. "He is a war hero, my dear," she had told Millicent, fanning herself languidly. "They are often moody. You need only be beautiful and agreeable. Louisa will handle the rest." The rest, as always, fell to Louisa. It was she who researched the Devereux family line, the extent of their lands, the health of their investments. And it was she who discovered the truth. The 8th Duke, Gideon's father, had been a catastrophic gambler.
The estate was mortgaged to the hilt.
The hero of the peninsula was land rich and cash poor, clinging to his title by a thread. Her first sight of him had been at a stifling society ball. He stood apart from the chattering crowds, a tall, severe figure in stark black evening dress. He looked utterly exhausted, not with the pleasant weariness of a partygoer, but with a deep, bone-settled fatigue that seemed to emanate from him like a chill. He was not charming. He did not smile. While other men flattered and flirted, he observed, his gaze missing nothing. That night, she had been standing in a quiet alcove, catching her breath, when she overheard two gentlemen discussing investments. One, a Mr. Carmichael, was boasting about a new canal venture, inflating its potential returns with blithe confidence. Without thinking, Louisa had spoken, her voice quiet but clear. "Forgive me, sir, but the tonnage duties you quote are for the northern passage. The southern locks cannot support that traffic. The true return, after maintenance levies, would be less than half." The men turned, startled to be addressed by a woman, a plain one at that. Mr. Carmichael had flushed with anger, but before he could deliver a cutting reply, another voice spoke from the shadows behind her. "She is correct." It was the Duke of Kestrel Chase. He had stepped forward, his gaze not on the affronted gentleman, but on her. It was not a look of admiration or flirtation. It was one of pure, unadorned assessment. He looked at her as if she were a column of figures, and he had just found her to be perfectly balanced. "You have a precise mind, Miss Penrose," she had supplied, her heart hammering. He gave a short, sharp nod. "Miss Penrose." He said her name as if filing it away for future reference. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her in a silence more profound than the noise he had interrupted. No one had ever looked at her and seen competence as a virtue. To her aunt, it was a utility. To others, it was an oddity. To the Duke of Kestrel Chase, for a single, startling moment, it had been a fact worthy of acknowledgement. It was a memory she held on to in the gray months that followed, a small, hard gem of recognition in a life of invisibility. That recognition was entirely absent now, across the desk in the cold library of his ancestral home. Here, she was not Miss Penrose, the woman with the precise mind. She was the faceless agent of his ruin, the voice of the creditor who held his entire world in their hands. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. To save Kestrel Chase, she had to become the very thing he despised. The opportunity had arisen suddenly. The Duke's primary lender, a banking house grown too bold, had collapsed. Its assets, including the massive mortgage on the Kestrel Chase estate, were to be sold at auction. Lady Farrow had been gleeful. "He'll be ruined! They'll break up the land. Serves the proud fool right for not showing the proper interest in Millicent." But Louisa had thought of the house she had only seen from a distance, a glorious sprawl of honey-colored stone. She thought of the tenant farmers whose families had worked that land for centuries. She thought of the Duke, standing alone at the ball, carrying the weight of his father's sins. And she had made a decision. She wrote to her father's man of business. She gave him instructions. And with the quiet stroke of a pen in a dusty city office, the fortune her merchant father had built bought the debt of a duke. Her solicitor, a dry, practical man named Mr. Ogilvy, had advised against her plan. To be the sole creditor of a man like that, Miss Penrose, it is a dangerous position. "It is more dangerous for the estate to be carved up by speculators," she had replied. "Propose these terms: a 5-year moratorium on principal payments, interest to be paid quarterly, but full authority over the estate's management is to be ceded to a representative of my choosing for the duration of the agreement." "And who," Mr. Ogilvy had asked, peering at her over his spectacles, "would that representative be?" Myself, Louisa had said. Which brought her here, to this library, to this standoff. Gideon Devereux believed he was facing the hired agent of some faceless city vulture. He did not know he was facing the quiet woman from the ball, the woman whose secret fortune was the only thing standing between his heritage and its dissolution. He saw an adversary, and perhaps he was right. She was here to save his home, but she would do it on her terms, with the cold, hard logic of the ledgers she knew so well. She would save Kestrel Chase not with pity, but with competence. It was the only way she knew. "The terms stand, Your Grace," she repeated, her voice perfectly even. "I am to have full access to all accounts, ledgers, and tenant agreements. I am to have final say on all expenditures exceeding £10. I will require rooms in the East Wing and will take my meals alone. In return, the estate will not be foreclosed upon. Do we have an agreement?" For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a grand, silent clock on the mantelpiece, a clock whose hands had not moved in a decade. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, a mask of aristocratic control. She saw the war in his eyes, the battle between his suffocating pride and his desperate love for this place. At last, he gave a single, clipped nod. "You have your agreement, Miss Penrose. See to it that your employer is satisfied. You have 5 years." He rose, a silent dismissal. Louisa stood as well, gathering her small portfolio of papers. Her hands were steady. She would not let him see that she was trembling inside. As she reached the door, he spoke again, his back to her. "I do not know who your master is, but tell him this. Kestrel Chase has weathered plagues and wars. It will weather this, and it will see the last of him." It was not a threat. It was a statement of faith, as stark and enduring as the stone walls around them. Louisa paused, her hand on the cold brass knob. She did not turn. "I will pass on the message, Your Grace," she said softly, and let herself out, closing the heavy oak door on the Duke and his noble, magnificent, bankrupt inheritance. Her new life began the following Monday. She arrived in a hired coach with a single trunk containing her practical gray and brown dresses, her books, and her own set of accounting ledgers, bound in plain, sturdy leather. The great house of Kestrel Chase loomed over the carriage path, more beautiful and more dilapidated than she had imagined. Stone griffins, their features blurred by centuries of rain, guarded a weed-choked entrance. Dozens of windows stared out like vacant eyes, many of them dark with grime. She was met at the door not by the Duke, but by a severe-looking woman in a black dress, her gray hair pulled into a tight, uncompromising bun. "I am Mrs. Draycott," she announced, her voice crisp. "The housekeeper. His Grace is occupied. I am to show you to your rooms." The chill of the entrance hall was profound. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn weather and everything to do with neglect. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light slanting from a high, grimy window. Furniture huddled under ghostly white dust cloths. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. It was the smell of a house that had lost its heart. Mrs. Draycott led her up a magnificent curving staircase, her own footsteps echoing in the silence. "The East Wing has been closed for some years," the housekeeper said, her tone implying this was a foolish extravagance. "We have aired the rooms as best we can." The rooms were spacious, and possessed a kind of faded grandeur. The wallpaper was peeling in one corner, and a damp stain marred the ceiling. But the view from the tall window was breathtaking. It looked out over a terraced garden that had long since run wild, and beyond, to a rolling parkland where a colossal oak tree stood alone, its mighty branches stark against the sky. Even from this distance, Louisa could see that several of the great limbs were dead. The tree, like the house, was dying from the inside out. It became, in that moment, a symbol of her task. She spent the first week not in the grand library, but in a small, dusty estate office off the kitchens. She had requested all the books from the past 20 years. They arrived in a precarious stack, delivered by a footman who looked at her with open suspicion. The ledgers were a disaster. Accounts had been kept sporadically, with entries in the late Duke's looping, arrogant script fading into months of utter neglect. Debts were listed without notation of interest. Rents were recorded without dates. It was a portrait of financial chaos, painted with aristocratic indifference. She worked from dawn until long after the house had fallen silent, fueled by weak tea and bread and cheese left for her by a sullen kitchen maid. She did not see the Duke at all. He remained a ghost in his own house, a presence she felt but never encountered. It was, she suspected, his design. He had ceded control, but he would not grant her the courtesy of his company. On the 7th day, she found it. Tucked into the back of a tenant ledger from a decade prior was a folded piece of paper. It was a valuation of the Kestrel Chase Forest, a vast tract of ancient woodland on the northern edge of the estate. The timber alone, a surveyor had noted, was worth a fortune, enough to clear a significant portion of the debt. A note was scrawled at the bottom in the old Duke's hand. "Too much trouble. Let it stand." He had been sitting on a lifeline and had been too indolent to grasp it. Armed with this, Louisa knew she had a place to start. That afternoon, she walked out of the house and towards the woods, needing to see the trees for herself. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. As she approached the edge of the forest, a figure on a great black horse emerged from the shadows of the trees. It was the Duke. He reined in his horse, looking down at her. He was dressed for riding, and the severe formality of his usual attire was replaced by a practical, rugged competence. For the first time, he looked less like a duke and more like a soldier. "The woods are not safe for a woman alone," he said. It was not a greeting. It was a command. "I am not here for a stroll, Your Grace," Louisa replied, refusing to be intimidated. She held up the paper she had brought with her. "I am here on business. Your father commissioned a timber survey 10 years ago. He was informed that a selective harvest of the mature oak and pine in the North Woods could yield upwards of £20,000. He did nothing. I wished to know why." His expression hardened. "My father had his reasons. That forest has stood untouched for 500 years. It will not be sold off for firewood on my watch." "I am not suggesting it be sold for firewood," she countered, her voice sharp with impatience. "I am suggesting a managed, selective harvest. The forester's report is quite clear. It would improve the health of the wood and provide funds to repair the tenants' cottages, mend the fences, and perhaps even pay the staff their full wages on time." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Shame, perhaps. He knew as well as she did that the estate was failing its people. "The Devereux family does not sell its timber," he said, his voice low and stubborn. "The Devereux family is in danger of having nothing left to sell," she retorted, her patience finally snapping. "Your pride is a luxury this estate cannot afford, Your Grace. Either we use the assets we have, or we will lose them all. The choice is yours, but my employer will not continue to finance sentimentality." She had gone too far. The air crackled with his fury. He swung down from his horse in one fluid, angry motion, landing silently on the turf before her. He was much taller than she was, a formidable wall of anger. He took a step closer, and it was then he delivered the warning she would never forget, the one that had echoed in the library just a week ago. Remember who you are speaking to. But this time, standing on the soil of his land, with the scent of his ancient trees in the air, her own resolve had hardened. She lifted her chin. I know who I am speaking to. A man who would rather watch his world crumble than bend. I am here to stop the crumbling, Your Grace, with or without your cooperation. She turned her back on him and began to walk back toward the house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She did not know if he would follow, if he would order her from his land. She only knew that she had laid her cards on the table. She had drawn a line in the damp earth of Kestrel Chase, and now she would see on which side he would choose to stand. She did not have to wait long for an answer. The next morning, a message was delivered by a footman. It was a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed with the ducal crest. It contained only 3 words, written in the Duke's stark, angular hand. Proceed with the survey. It was not an apology. It was not an alliance. But it was a beginning. Louisa hired a new surveyor from the town of Maryvale, a practical man named Hobbs, with calloused hands and an honest gaze. For 2 weeks, they walked the North Woods together, marking trees, calculating yields, and planning the harvest with meticulous care. During this time, the Duke remained absent, though Louisa often felt as though she were being watched. Sometimes, from the corner of her eye, she would glimpse a rider on a black horse on a distant ridge, a silent, solitary observer. Her presence at Kestrel Chase began to cause ripples. Lady Farrow wrote a series of increasingly agitated letters. What is the meaning of this preposterous arrangement? You have embarrassed us all. Millicent is mortified. You are to return to London at once. Louisa read the letters and placed them, unanswered, in a locked drawer. Her aunt's power over her had vanished the moment she'd signed the papers for the Duke's debt. A more venomous opposition came from Arabella Sinclair, a neighboring landowner's daughter, a diamond of the first water, who had long considered the Duke her personal property. She began to spread whispers in the county that Miss Penrose was an adventuress, a woman of low birth and lower morals, who had somehow inveigled her way into the Duke's confidence, that she was his mistress, installed in his home. The rumors were poison, intended to isolate her, to make her position untenable. Louisa ignored them. She had lived with social invisibility for so long that social condemnation felt like a blunt weapon. Her focus was on the work. The first revenues from the timber harvest began to arrive. With it, she paid the staff their back wages in full. She hired masons to repair the roof and glaziers to replace the broken windows. She authorized the purchase of new seed for the tenant farmers and a new bull for the home farm. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the house began to breathe again. The chill in the great hall receded. Mrs. Draycott, the formidable housekeeper, began to unbend. One evening, she found a cup of hot, sweet tea waiting for her in the estate office. "You'll work yourself into an early grave, miss," the housekeeper had said, her tone still gruff, but the gesture was one of undeniable care. It was the first act of kindness Louisa had received since arriving. She nearly wept over it. The Duke watched the changes from a distance. He saw the smoke rising from more chimneys, the tenants tipping their hats with a renewed vigor, the shine returning to the hallway floors. He saw Louisa, poring over her ledgers late into the night, her face pale with fatigue, but set with determination. He saw a woman who worked with the relentless, quiet efficiency of a force of nature. It was not pity he felt for her. It was something harder and more respectful. It was grudging admiration. He began to join her for dinner. Not in the cavernous, cold dining hall, but in the small study next to the library, before a crackling fire. They did not speak much at first. The meals were formal, strained affairs, but gradually a routine developed. She would tell him of the day's progress, the output of the sawyers, a dispute over a boundary fence, the rising price of wool. He, in turn, would listen, asking sharp, insightful questions. He began to speak of the land, not in terms of finance, but with a deep, ancestral love. He told her which fields flooded in the spring, which coverts were best for game, the history of the families who had farmed his land for generations. He was sharing his world with her, piece by piece. She, in turn, was restoring it. It was a strange, unspoken partnership, forged in ledgers and timber, built on a foundation of mutual necessity. One evening, as she was detailing a plan to drain the water meadows, he interrupted her. "My father tried that. The clay soil is too dense." "I'm aware," she said, pulling a map towards them. "But your father tried to drain it to the south. The fall is insufficient. If we cut a new channel to the north, behind Heron Copse, the gradient is steep enough to carry the water away." He studied the map, his brow furrowed in concentration. He traced the line she had drawn with his finger. "It would work," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the table. The winter sky in his gaze seemed, for a moment, to have thawed. "You see things, Miss Penrose. Things that others miss." In that moment, the distance between them shrank. She was no longer just the agent of his creditor. He was no longer just the proud, difficult duke. They were two people, sitting before a fire, trying to save a home. The feeling that bloomed in her chest was warm and dangerous, and she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that she was no longer just fighting for Kestrel Chase. She was fighting for the man who was its heart. This fragile truce was not destined to last. As Louisa's influence grew, so did the desperation of her enemies. Lady Farrow, deprived of her unpaid servant and her access to what she believed was a small inheritance, was becoming frantic. She found a willing and dangerous ally in Fletcher Carmichael, the same man Louisa had corrected at the ball. Mr. Carmichael had his own reasons for wanting to see the Duke of Kestrel Chase ruined, having been spurned in a land deal years before. Together with the venomous Arabella Sinclair, they began to plot a more direct attack. The weapon they chose was the one Louisa valued most: her integrity. Their opportunity came during the quarterly rent collection. It was Louisa's policy to record every payment in her private ledger first, with the tenant present, before transferring the sums to the official estate books that evening. It was a system of double entry that left no room for error, a habit born of years managing her aunt's chaotic finances. One afternoon, while Louisa was meeting with a tenant in the village of Maryvale, Mr. Carmichael paid a visit to Kestrel Chase. He told a footman he had an urgent message for Miss Penrose and was shown into the estate office to wait. He was there for less than 10 minutes. It was long enough. With a vial of specially prepared ink and a cleverly forged nib, he opened the official estate ledger to the current page. In a passable imitation of Louisa's neat script, he added 3 entries for rents not yet due, pocketing the sizable sum of cash he had brought with him for the purpose. He then carefully blotted the page and departed, leaving a poisoned seed planted in the heart of the Duke's recovering home. Louisa returned late, tired but satisfied. The rents were in, the tenants were content. She sat down at her desk to transfer the day's accounts into the main ledger. When she opened the book, she saw them. The 3 false entries. Her blood ran cold. The ink was a shade too dark, the slant of the letters a fraction too severe, but to a casual observer, it would look like her hand. And the sums recorded, a total of £100, were not in the cash box. She understood instantly. It was a trap, a carefully laid snare designed to brand her a thief. She sat there for a long time in the deepening twilight, the fraudulent ledger open before her. She thought of the progress she had made, the budding trust with the Duke, the slow revival of the great house. All of it was about to be burned to the ground by a few strokes of a poisoned pen. She did not cry. She took a slow, steadying breath, closed the book, and locked it, along with her own private ledger, in the desk drawer. There was nothing to do now but wait for the axe to fall. It fell 2 days later. The Duke summoned her to the library. The room was cold again, the fire unlit. He stood by the window, staring out at the rain lashing the glass. He did not turn when she entered. "Mr. Carmichael paid me a visit this morning," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He expressed some concern for my welfare. He suggested that my trust in you might be misplaced." Louisa stood silently by the door, her hands clasped before her. "And what did you say, Your Grace?" "I said that Mr. Carmichael was a known gossip and a failed speculator, and that I would thank him not to meddle in my affairs," the Duke replied, still facing the window. "He then suggested I examine the estate ledger for last Tuesday. He was quite specific." He finally turned, and the look on his face was one she had never seen before. It was a terrible mixture of doubt, anger, and a deep, weary pain. In his hand, he held the poisoned ledger. "He said I would find a discrepancy of £100, a sum recorded but not deposited. Explain it." This was the moment, the test. Her entire future, and the future of Kestrel Chase, hung on the next few minutes. She could have pleaded, protested her innocence, burst into tears, but that was not her way. Her strength was not in emotion, but in fact. "May I see the book?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He hesitated, then placed it on the desk between them. She walked forward and opened it to the page. She pointed to the 3 entries. "These are forgeries. The handwriting is remarkably similar to your own, Miss Penrose. It is a clever imitation, I grant you, but look at the ink. It is darker. It has bled slightly into the paper, which my own ink does not. And look at the capital T in Treadwell. I do not loop my T's in that fashion. I never have." She spoke with the calm precision of a scholar defending a thesis. She was not begging for his belief. She was presenting him with evidence. He bent closer, his eyes narrowed, examining the script. She saw the flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. She pressed her advantage. "I have my own ledger, Your Grace, a private accounts book where I mirror all entries. It has been my habit for years. It is in the office drawer, which is locked. The key is on my person. I invite you to send for a locksmith, open the drawer, and compare the 2 books side by side." She held his gaze, unflinching. She was offering him the truth, but he had to be willing to take it. The silence stretched, thick with suspicion and the drumming of the rain. She saw the struggle within him. He was a man betrayed before, by his father's weakness, by the horrors of war. Trust was a foreign country to him. "There will be no need for a locksmith," he said at last, his voice rough. He strode from the room, leaving her alone with the damning ledger. She did not move. She simply waited, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. He was gone for what felt like an eternity. When he returned, he carried her plain, leather-bound private ledger in his hand. He had clearly forced the lock. He opened it on the desk beside the other one. The page for Tuesday in her book showed only the legitimate rent payments. The sums matched the cash in the box to the penny. The evidence was irrefutable. One book was a lie, the other was the truth. He stared at the two pages, his face a mask of stone. "Carmichael lied," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He looked up at her then, and the pain and suspicion in his eyes had been replaced by a slow-burning fury. But it was not directed at her. "He did this. He came here and did this to you. To us." He closed the forged ledger with a snap that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "This will not stand." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. It was a raw, fierce protectiveness. It was the look of a man who had chosen his side and would defend it to the death. "I was wrong to doubt you, Louisa." He used her given name for the first time. It fell into the space between them not as an intimacy, but as an oath, a promise. He was no longer her employer, nor she the agent of his creditor. In that moment of shared crisis, they became allies, partners. "He will not get away with this," Gideon said, his voice deadly calm. "There will be a reckoning, and it will be public." We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The reckoning was planned with the cold precision of a military campaign. The Duke announced he would be hosting a dinner to celebrate the successful beginning of the estate's restoration. The guest list was small but strategic. Lady Farrow and her daughter Millicent were invited, as was Fletcher Carmichael and his silent, watchful wife. Arabella Sinclair received an invitation she could not refuse. And, at Louisa's suggestion, the Duke also invited Lady Theodosia Carmichael, a distant cousin of Fletcher's, a dowager countess with a tongue as sharp as shattered glass and a reputation for unimpeachable integrity. She was the perfect witness. The night of the dinner, Kestrel Chase was transformed. For the first time in years, the great hall was ablaze with candlelight. The floors shone, the silver was polished, and fires roared in every hearth. The house was alive, showing its splendor as a warning to those who had come to gloat over its demise. Louisa dressed with care in a simple gown of deep blue velvet. She wore no jewelry, only the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. When she descended the staircase, the Duke was waiting for her at the bottom. He was magnificent in his formal black attire, no longer the weary soldier, but the master of his domain. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. When she reached him, he held out his arm. "Miss Penrose," he said, his voice low for her ears only. "Tonight, you are not my agent. You are my honored guest. Stay by my side." She took his arm, the fine wool of his coat solid and reassuring beneath her fingers. It was a public declaration, a shield offered before the battle had even begun. As they entered the drawing room, every eye turned to them. She saw the shock on Lady Farrow's face, the flash of venom in Arabella Sinclair's eyes, and the smug confidence on Fletcher Carmichael's face. He believed he was attending a victory celebration. He had no idea he was walking into his own public execution. Dinner was a tense affair. The Duke was a formidable host, guiding the conversation with a cool authority that kept his unsuspecting guests off balance. Lady Farrow attempted to belittle Louisa with backhanded compliments about her usefulness. Arabella Sinclair aimed cutting remarks about her dress. Louisa met it all with a serene composure that seemed to infuriate them further. Finally, after the plates were cleared and the port was poured, the Duke rose. A hush fell over the table. "I have gathered you here tonight," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "not only to mark a turning point for Kestrel Chase, but to address a matter of honour." He let the words hang in the air. Carmichael shifted in his seat, a slight, self-satisfied smile on his lips. "A matter of honour, Duke. Do enlighten us." "I will," Gideon said, his gaze locking with Carmichael's. "It has come to my attention that a significant sum of money, £100 to be precise, was stolen from the estate office last week." A collective gasp went through the room. Lady Farrow looked triumphant. "Stolen?" she exclaimed. "Good heavens! One can't be too careful about the people one lets into one's house." Her eyes slid meaningfully toward Louisa. "Indeed, one cannot," the Duke agreed, his voice smooth as silk. "The theft was cleverly done. The sum was recorded in the estate ledger, but the cash itself was missing. It was made to look as though our very capable agent, Miss Penrose, had embezzled the funds." He paused, letting the accusation settle. Louisa felt the weight of every gaze at the table, hostile and curious. She kept her eyes on her folded hands in her lap. Carmichael leaned forward. "A dreadful business, Duke, but not perhaps surprising. When one hires from outside one's class." "The interesting thing," the Duke continued, cutting him off, "is the ledger itself." He gestured to a footman, who stepped forward and placed the two account books, the official ledger and Louisa's private one, on the polished table. "You see, Mr. Carmichael, Miss Penrose keeps two sets of books. A professional habit, to ensure accuracy. The official ledger showed the fraudulent entry. Her private ledger, which was locked in her desk, did not." Carmichael's confident expression began to falter. "A convenient second ledger, to be sure." "Isn't it?" the Duke said. "So convenient that it forced me to ask a question. How could someone have made a forged entry in the official book without access to Miss Penrose's desk? And then I remembered. You paid a visit that day, Mr. Carmichael. You were left alone in the office for several minutes." The colour drained from Carmichael's face. "This is an outrage. Are you accusing me?" "I am stating facts," Gideon said, his voice turning to steel. "But I am a simple man. Handwriting is a complex matter, which is why I took the liberty of inviting an expert from London. Mr. Abbott?" A small, spectacled man, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, stood up. He adjusted his glasses. "Your Grace, ladies and gentlemen, I have had the opportunity to examine the ledgers in question, as well as several samples of both Miss Penrose's and Mr. Carmichael's handwriting. The conclusion is unequivocal. The three entries are forgeries. The ink is inconsistent with the rest of the page, and the letter formations, while a fair imitation, they're telltale signs of Mr. Carmichael's own hand. Specifically, the pressure on the downstroke of the letter P. It is as unique as a fingerprint." A stunned silence descended. Carmichael sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. It was Lady Theodosia who broke the spell. She took a delicate sip of her wine and looked down the table at her cousin. "Fletcher, dear boy," she said, her voice carrying with lethal clarity, "I always told you that you were a clumsy forger.
Your attempt to alter your school reports was just as pathetic.
It seems you have not improved with age. The quiet, devastating pronouncement shattered Carmichael's composure. He sputtered, half rising from his chair, his face mottling with rage and humiliation. Arabella Sinclair stared at him in horror, as if seeing him for the first time. But the Duke had not finished. He turned his cold gaze upon Lady Farrow. "And you, madam. It seems your desire to discredit your niece is not merely a matter of social malice. I also had my solicitor investigate Miss Penrose's inheritance. He discovered that you have made 3 separate and quite illegal attempts to have the funds transferred to your own name. I believe the word for that is fraud." Lady Farrow gave a strangled cry. Her daughter, Millicent, finally broke her silence. She looked at her mother, her pretty face filled with a dawning horror and disillusionment. "Mother, is that true?" she whispered. That was the final blow. To be exposed not only as a criminal, but as a fool, in front of her own daughter and the society she so desperately courted. Lady Farrow collapsed back in her chair, speechless. The Duke looked around the table at the wreckage of his enemies. His victory was absolute. "I believe," he said with chilling finality, "this dinner party is at an end. You will find your carriages waiting." Later that evening, the house was quiet again. The disgraced guests had fled into the night, their reputations in tatters. Louisa stood at the window in the library, looking out at the moonlit grounds. The great, ancient oak stood silhouetted against the sky, its bare branches reaching like arms to the heavens. She heard the door open and close behind her. Gideon came to stand beside her. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the clouds drift across the moon. "It is done," he said at last. "Yes," she replied softly. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "There is one last piece of business, Louisa." He hesitated, and for the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Kestrel Chase looked uncertain. "My solicitor did more than investigate your aunt. He investigated the consortium that holds my debt. The paper trail was complex, but it led, eventually, to a single source. A modest but cleverly managed inheritance left by a merchant to his only daughter." Louisa's heart stopped. She could not speak. "It was you," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of wonder. "All this time, it was you. You bought my debt. You saved my home." She found her voice a mere whisper. "I did not want to see it broken up. I did not want to see it fall into the hands of men like Carmichael." "You saved it from me," he corrected her gently. "From my pride. From my despair." He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. "I have nothing to offer you. The estate is yours by right of debt. The house, the lands, the title, they are all forfeit to you, if you choose to claim them." He took her hand, his grasp firm and warm. Then he did something that shattered all her carefully constructed defenses. He knelt. The Duke of Kestrel Chase, on one knee on the worn library carpet, before the penniless orphan who owned his entire world. "I cannot repay the money, Louisa. Not for many years. But I can offer you the only thing of value I have left. Myself. My name. My life." His voice was rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before.
Do not be my creditor. Be my partner. Be my duchess. Be my wife. Help me bring Kestrel Chase back to life, not as my agent, but as its mistress. Together. Tears she had refused to shed for 10 years of misery and loneliness finally fell. They traced hot paths down her cheeks. She looked down at the proud, humbled man before her, the man she had fought for, the man she had come to love. "Yes," she whispered. It was the only word she needed. "Yes. Plainly. Together." He rose, and his hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears.
And in the quiet of the great library, with the ghosts of his ancestors as their witnesses, Gideon Devereux, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, bone-deep recognition. It was the meeting of two solitary souls who had, against all odds, found their home in each other. The epilogue of their story was written not in dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of the passing seasons. 2 years later, a visitor to Kestrel Chase would have found a place utterly transformed. The gardens bloomed in manicured splendor, the stone of the great house glowed warm in the sun, and the sound of laughter could often be heard echoing from the open windows. The estate was not yet entirely free of debt, but it was solvent, productive, and filled with a sense of purpose it had not known for a generation. Louisa, now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, was its heart. She was respected by the tenants, who saw her not as a distant aristocrat, but as a fair and astute steward of the land. She was beloved by the staff, who knew that the warmth in the hearths and the food on their tables was due to her tireless competence. She moved through the grand rooms of the house with a quiet grace, her presence a constant, reassuring hum of life. One crisp autumn afternoon, she stood with Gideon on the terrace overlooking the park. In her arms, she held their infant son, a healthy, happy baby with his father's serious winter sky eyes. Gideon's arm was wrapped securely around her waist, his hand resting on hers. They were watching the great oak tree. Its dead limbs had been carefully pruned away, and a flush of new, vigorous green growth covered its ancient branches. It was no longer dying. It was healing, just as the house had, just as he had. "The final timber payment came in this morning," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We are officially profitable for the first time in 30 years. "We are," he corrected her, his voice filled with a quiet pride. He looked not at the tree, but at her, his wife. "You did this, Louisa. You saw the value in things others had written off." She smiled. Later that day, in the library that was now their shared sanctuary, she unlocked a drawer in her old desk. She took out her plain, leather-bound private ledger. Its pages were filled with the neat columns of figures that had been her shield and her weapon for so long. She ran her hand over the worn cover. It was no longer a record of servitude or a tool for survival. It was a testament to the fact that competence could be a form of courage, and that a quiet, steady hand could rebuild a world. She placed a dried oak leaf between its pages and closed it for the last time. She occasionally received letters from her cousin Millicent, who had married a respectable but unexciting country baronet. The tone was no longer one of pity, but of a quiet, wondering respect. Her aunt, Lady Farrow, lived in reduced circumstances in Bath, a bitter ghost at a permanent card table, her fraud never prosecuted, but her social ruin absolute. Fletcher Carmichael and his wife had removed to the continent. Arabella Sinclair had married a wealthy, aging earl. Their world had moved on, leaving them behind. As evening fell, Gideon came into the library and found her sitting by the fire, their son sleeping peacefully in a cradle beside her. He knelt by her chair and took her hand, raising it to his lips. No grand declarations were needed between them anymore. Their love was in the shared silence, the easy companionship, the certain knowledge that they were partners in every sense of the word. They had faced down ruin and malice and had built a life on a foundation of truth, respect, and 2 sets of perfectly balanced books. Outside, the wind rustled through the leaves of the recovering oak, a sound like a promise kept. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.